Hi guys, this is part 2 of the Align series. In this video, I'm going to show you how to distribute objects and distribute spacing using the Align panel in Adobe Illustrator. In part 1, we covered how to use all of the Align functions in the Align panel. If you missed it, click on the link below to watch. Alright, so now you've learned all about aligning, which is the top row that we have here. Now we need to learn how to distribute our objects. And we can also distribute them in 3 different ways. We can align our distribution to selection, to key objects, or to the artboard. So I think the easiest way to explain this is by aligning to selection at first. So I'm going to move these around a little bit more, and I'm selecting over these. And we're going to see what happens when we do our vertical distribute top command. So I'm clicking on that. And basically what it did was it made the space from the top edge of one object to the next object the same for all of the objects. So you see, when I copy that dashed line over, the space from the very top edge of one object to the very top edge of the next object is the same for each object to the next object relative to one another. So I'm selecting all my objects and I'm clicking on Vertical Distribute Center. And we see the distance between the center of the first object to the center of the second object is represented by this blue dotted line here. So now when we move the same dotted line to the center of the second object and we click on the third object, the distance is the same from the center of this object to the center of this object. And now if we move this measurement line again to the center of the third object, you'll see that it's the same exact distance to the center of the fourth object. And if we move our measurement line again to the center of the fourth object, we see that it's the same exact measurement to the center of the last object. And now if we do vertical distribute bottom, and we select all our shapes and click on that, you'll see that it distributed the shapes evenly according to the distance between the bottom of one shape to another. So we see that this blue dashed line represents the distance between the bottom edge of the first shape to the bottom edge of the second shape. And if we copy that measurement line over, we can see that it's the exact same difference from the bottom of the second shape to the bottom of the third shape. And if we copy that over again, it's the same exact distance from the bottom of the third shape to the fourth shape. And if we copy it again, it's the same exact distance from the bottom of the fourth shape to the last shape. So now let's try horizontal distribution. So if we select all our shapes, and I click on this command, what this did was it distributed the space evenly between the shapes from the left edge of one shape to the left edge of the next shape. So this blue dashed line represents the distance between the left edge of the first shape and the left edge of the next shape. And if we copy that over, we can see that it's the exact same difference from the second shape to the third shape. And we'll copy that again, and we'll see that it's the exact same distance between the left side of the third shape and the left side of the fourth shape. And if we copy it one more time, we can see that it's the exact same distance from the left side of the fourth shape to the left side of the last shape. So now let's try the next command, which is horizontal distribute center. And I'm selecting all my objects. And when I click on this, what it did now was it distributed the shapes evenly from center to center of one shape to the next. So this blue dashed line represents the distance between the center of the first shape to the center of the second shape. And if we copy this over, we can see that it's the exact same distance between the center of the second shape to the center of the third shape. And if we copy it over again, we can see that it's the exact same distance from the center of the third shape to the center of the fourth shape. And if we copy that one more time, we'll find that it's the exact same distance from the center of the fourth shape to the center of the last shape. And now let's try this last method of distribution, which is horizontal distribute right. So I'm clicking on that. And what that did was it distributed the objects evenly from the right edge of one object to the right edge of the next object. So this blue dashed line represents the distance between the right edge of the first object and the right edge of the second object. And when we copy that over, we can see that it's the same distance from the right edge of the second object to the right edge of the third object. And when we copy it again, we can see that it's the same distance from the right edge of the third object to the right edge of the fourth object. And we'll copy that one more time, and we can see that it's the same distance from the right edge of the fourth object to the right edge of the last object. So when you're using these 6 commands on distribute objects, and instead of aligning to selection, you're aligning to your artboard instead, it's gonna work in the same exact way that I just explained, except that your first and last objects are going to align themselves to the edges of the artboard, and then your other objects will be distributed accordingly after that. So I'm gonna show you the difference between aligning to selection and aligning to artboard when you're distributing your objects. If we take these objects right here and align them to selection using this first command, vertical distribute top, you'll see, as explained before, the objects are distributed evenly from the top edge of one object to the top edge of the next object. So let's go back. And if you do that same command, but you have align to artboard checked, it also still distributed the objects evenly from top edge to top edge of one object to the next, but it aligned the first and last objects with the edges of the artboard. And that's going to be the difference when you distribute your objects using align to artboard. We can also compare this horizontally. So if you distribute horizontal left using align to selection, all the left edges are evenly distributed from one object to the next object. But if we do that same command using align to artboard, it will do the same thing, except that your first and last objects are now aligned to the edges of the artboard. And just so you know, these commands also allow you to align and distribute your objects diagonally. So if you just roughly have them spread out in this diagonal way, you can select your objects and vertical distribute center, and then horizontal distribute center, and you'll get a nice neat diagonal arrangement there. And if you want to fit it to your artboard, just do the same thing, vertical distribute center and horizontal distribute center, but with align to artboard checked, and you'll get it perfectly diagonal according to your artboard. So now let's move on to distribute spacing. Distribute objects distributes your shapes relative to either one of the edges or the center of each object, one to another. But distribute spacing will distribute only the spacing between the objects. So you'll see that the spacing between these two objects is pretty far apart, but then these objects are closer together, and I clicked on vertical distribute space, and this blue dashed line represents the spacing between the first object and the second object. And if I copy that over, you'll see that I have the same spacing between the second object and third object, the third object and the fourth object, and the fourth object and the last object. So here the distribution is only for the spacing. It doesn't matter where the center of each object is or how big each object is, you're gonna get the same amount of space between each object. But if we move these over and we do that same command, but we have align to artboard checked instead, this is what happens. Now you're not going to get any space in there because it's aligning to the artboard. So it's still aligning the top and the bottom to the artboard. And right now they don't fit in the artboard. So if we made these objects small enough that they could fit in the artboard, and we did this random distribution here, and then we selected them, still clicked on align to artboard, and we clicked on vertical distribute space, it will give us the same amount of space between each object vertically, but it will first align your first object and your last object to the edges of the artboard. Now let's do distribute spacing horizontally. So we're on align to selection, and each of these shapes has a different amount of spacing from one object to the other horizontally. So I select all my objects and I click on horizontal distribute space, and you'll see that this blue dashed line represents the amount of space between the first object and the second object. And if we copy that over, there's the same exact amount of space between the second object and the third object. And if we copy that over again, there's the same amount of space between the third object and the fourth object. And if we copy it again, there's the same amount of space between the fourth object and the last object. Now you might be wondering what this is right here. It looks like you can input some numbers. So what this is a way to distribute spacing using actual measurements. Like you see it says 0 inches. You can actually input how many inches you want the spacing to be in between objects. So right now this command is grayed out, but if you select a key object, you can input a value to make your spacing. So I'm gonna select all my objects and I'm clicking on the green rectangle to make it my key object. And what this means is that the green rectangle will stay where it is and the other objects will move over and will be distributed with spacing according to whatever spacing I put in here. So let's input 1 inch and then I'm clicking on horizontal distribute space. And you'll see that the green rectangle did not move and the other rectangles moved over so that the spacing between this shape and the green rectangle is 1 inch. You can see here the width of this blue line is exactly 1 inch. And then I'm going to copy that same 1 inch blue line over here and you can see that the spacing between these two objects is now 1 inch. And the spacing between these two objects is now 1 inch. And the spacing between the last two objects is also 1 inch. And we can do that specific distribution vertically as well. We're selecting over all of them and I'm going to select the fuchsia rectangle as my key object, just clicking on it once without pressing anything else. And I'm also going to make the vertical spacing now 1 inch. So I'm clicking on vertical distribute space and you'll see that the fuchsia rectangle didn't move and the other shapes are now 1 inch apart from one another vertically. So this blue line right here is exactly 1 inch in height. So the space between the first object and the second object is 1 inch. And if I copy that over, the space between the second object and the third object is 1 inch. And the space between the third object and the fourth object is 1 inch. And the space between the fourth object and the last object is 1 inch. So that allows you to distribute your objects with exact measurements. Okay, so now you know how to align your objects. And you know what all of these options mean. So that completes part 2. Make sure to click on the link below for part 3 of this series, practical examples of how to use the align and distribute functions in the real world. You won't want to miss it.